Welcome to this recording of the PFAS MCL Rule Public Water Supplier and Operator Training. This recording will cover Lesson 4, Compliance. So here's what we'll cover in this lesson. First, we'll examine how compliance with the MCL is determined. In fact, we'll spend the bulk of the lesson on MCL compliance. We'll explain how monitoring and reporting violations are determined as well, and we'll describe appropriate violation response for water systems. So first, let's talk about compliance with the MCL. As a quick refresher, compliance monitoring for PFAS occurs at the entry point to the distribution system. So the entry point is that sampling point that is finished water, representative of each source, but prior to the first customer. Also to review from the last lesson, here are the PFAS MCLs. Remember, under the PFAS MCL rule, you are monitoring for two PFAS, PFOA and PFOS. The maximum contaminant levels are 14 parts per trillion or nanograms per liter and 18 parts per trillion for PFOS. So if a system exceeds either level, is it immediately a violation? Well, it's not quite that simple. For systems on quarterly monitoring, MCL compliance is actually based on the running annual average. So let's look at what this means. The running annual average is the average of the results from the most recent 4 quarters. So here we have shown Q1, which is quarter 1, Q2 plus Q3 plus Q4 divided by 4 gives us our running annual average. The next quarter, this is the reason it's called running, we drop off quarter 1 and we add quarter 5. So 2, 3, 4, 5 are averaged together by dividing by 4, and that gives you your latest running annual average. So the reason we're talking about this is initial monitoring is quarterly. So compliance for initial monitoring is the running annual average of the first 4 quarters of data for both PFOA and PFOS at each entry point is important. So let's look at a system's PFOA results first as an example. Here's their first 4 quarters of data at entry point 101. You can see the second quarter was non-detect, but there's 3 detections in the other quarters. So to calculate the running annual average, that is done by adding the 4 quarters together and dividing by 4. But note, if it's a non-detect like shown here, in the calculation that is becomes a 0, considered 0 in the calculation. So we do this here and we have a result of 4.25. Now, here's something to note with the MCL. They're all in whole numbers, like you see the 14, no decimal places. So we have to round our running annual average to a whole number. So to do this, we look at the digit after the decimal place to round. We don't want to double round here. So we faded out the 5. We don't make it 4.3 first or something. Fade out the 5. We're going to ignore that. And we just look at the 2. And, of course, 4.2 becomes 4 as a whole number. If it had been 4.5, then that would round to 5. And compared to the running annual average there. So since the MCL here is 14, this system for PFOA at this entry point is in compliance. But as we said, compliance is determined for each entry point for both PFOA and PFOS. So for the same example system, here's the data for PFOA again for entry point 101. And we've now also added the PFOS data in the bottom of the table here. So you can see they had all detections, but the running annual average is still below the MCLs calculated to 6 here. And this system has 2 entry points. So here's the data for entry point 102 at the Friendly Waters Borough. You can see they just had one detect in the third quarter at entry point 102. So with all the quarter results in, each running annual average is compared to the appropriate MCL. You can see in the last two columns here. You can see that Friendly Waters Borough is in compliance based on initial monitoring because all those calculated running annual averages are less than the corresponding MCLs. Something to just also note, if a quarterly sample is missed, then the running annual average is based on 3 quarters of data. So then in this situation, the total is divided by 3. If it's still divided by 4, but you missed a quarter, that would essentially dilute the running annual average concentration. So can you have an MCL violation before the end of 4 quarters? Well, let's take a look, because yes, you actually can. Here's an example again, quarter 1 at Friendly Waters per PFOA. Let's say it was 31 parts per trillion. So what we'll do, the DEP data system, as this data is coming in, we're immediately dividing by 4. And this is what should be done here, and we'll take a look at why. So the first quarter comes in, and 31 is actually divided by 4. So far, okay, your running annual average is well below the running annual average, or the MCL of 14. Here we get our second quarter of data. You can see that it's 29, and the 29 is added to 31 and still divided by 4. Well, now what do we get? Well, that is 15. And that is actually greater than the MCL already. You know, even if the next 2 quarters then were non-detect or 0, that wouldn't change this, and it would still be 15. So any kind of results would even, still be over the MCL there. So in this case, we have an MCL violation before 4 quarters. And so we just wanted to point this out so that you know that this can happen during initial monitoring, where you end up with an MCL violation before the 4 quarters are up. So then after initial monitoring, you start what is called repeat monitoring. So for any PFAS contaminant on quarterly monitoring, compliance is still based on the running annual average, even in repeat monitoring. So we see that here. So as an example, this system had to essentially, they stayed on quarterly monitoring. And again, just like in initial monitoring, all compliance is based on the running annual average like shown here. And the running annual average here was 7 for PFOA. So we're looking good. It's below the MCL of 14. But what about systems that can go to annual or triennial in the repeat monitoring? So after initial, they're put on annual or triennial. How do we determine an MCL violation then? Here's how it works. If a result exceeds the MCL for just a routine result, then you are required to collect a confirmation sample, as we mentioned in the previous lesson. So then the results of the routine sample and the confirmation sample are averaged and compared to the MCL for compliance. So if the average of the routine and the confirmation sample exceeds the MCL, it is a violation. Let's look at an example. Here we have location 101, and we had the PFOA result of 21. All right, well, we know we have to collect a confirmation sample. We collect that, it's 23, and divided by 2, we average it. That's 22, which is over the MCL of 14, and that's an MCL violation. So the idea here is this is an immediate MCL violation rather than waiting for the calculating the running annual average like you would do if you're on quarterly monitoring. So the system here, however, does begin quarterly monitoring after this. It's put back on that frequency, essentially. And we'll go into continue our example here in a moment. But it's important to note that as a reminder for water systems that DEP must be contacted within 1 hour of becoming aware of any MCL exceedance. So even though the analytical result exceeding the MCL might not be immediately causing a violation, 1 hour reporting is required for any MCL exceedance. So you see that number is greater than the MCL, call DEP within 1 hour when you become aware of that. Continue our example then. We said that they went back on quarterly monitoring. So in terms of compliance, this August 2025 sample that we had here where the violation began, they go into quarterly monitoring. So this violation actually remains open until they get the full 4 quarters of data. So you get that at violation when you're on annual or triennial, and it does remain open then for at least until the running annual average is calculated, meaning you do have to do public notification every 3 months, and we'll discuss that in the next lesson. So now you begin quarterly monitoring for that running annual average calculation. That first routine sample result is actually used as the first quarter. And then you continue, and that's why we put question marks here. So you don't have to start fresh the next quarter. You're already on quarter 2 in the next quarter, 2, 3, 4, and we'll calculate our running annual average. This is called increased monitoring. When you go from annual or triennial and your frequency increases to quarterly, it's called increased monitoring. So again, for compliance, you begin quarterly monitoring, and the second quarter is added to the previous result and divided by 4. So again, we're not waiting till the end of 4 quarters to do the calculation here. So let's look at this. We have quarter 2, 22 plus 14 divided by 4 is 9. And that is compared to the MCL. You can see it's less than the MCL of 14. So let's jump to the rest of the quarters then. We'll say at the end of quarter 4 then we have all our results in. You can see our numbers here on the screen, and we divide by 4, and what do we come up with? 16. So that is slightly over the MCL of 14 for PFOA. And we would have a violation then, again, essentially, a new violation for the running annual average here. And this system has some issues as they continue to get violations for PFOA at entry point 101. So what then is the general kind of outline of the public water system response here then to an MCL violation? First, again, report to DEP within 1 hour. This is for any MCL exceedance, including an MCL violation. You're reporting that to DEP within 1 hour, contacting DEP essentially. You're providing Tier 2 public notification, and we're going to discuss that in the next lesson. You're increasing your monitoring to quarterly if you're not already on quarterly monitoring. So again, if you're on triennial or annual, you're going back to quarterly monitoring and the increased monitoring. You're taking investigative or corrective action. So what does that mean? Well, maybe you can eliminate the source of contamination, maybe take a source offline, maybe you can blend a source with another one. Now, to note though, that would require a permit, any kind of blending. Do you have PFAS treatment, and is there an issue with it? Or maybe you'll have to install PFAS treatment as a response. And we'll talk a little bit about that some more here. So what about treatment? Well, the necessity for treatment will be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. DEP staff will take into consideration the historical data, the source or sources of contamination, and what's going on there, looking at trends and everything. So it's very important to remember, however, that all treatment requires a permit to come into, so you'll be working with DEP on that. But in general, let's look at the treatment options that you have for PFAS, BAT in the heading here, that stands for Best Available Technology. So what are the technologies available for treating for PFAS? Well, these are all technologies that have been around. There's nothing new here. We have granular activated carbon, or ion exchange, or reverse osmosis. Let's just take a brief look at these here. First, granular activated carbon. Well, the carbon surface of GAC has a strong affinity for many synthetic organic contaminants, including PFAS compounds. So we get this adsorption to the surface here. Another treatment technology is ion exchange. So ion exchange involves the exchange of ions in the water. So you have these resins in the unit that are conditioned with chloride ions, which are released into the water and exchanged with PFAS ions, taking their place in this case. Then we have reverse osmosis, which is basically a membrane filtration that simply blocks out large molecules like PFAS while allowing small molecules through to go through the water. So just wanted to essentially mention these are the best available technologies for PFAS treatment. You'd be working with DEP permitting staff to work through what would take place here for permitting of any of these treatments. Okay, so that was MCL compliance and a little bit on treatment. Now let's talk about monitoring and reporting violations under the PFAS MCL rule. Monitoring and reporting violations under the rule include a failure to monitor according to the required schedule for PFOA or PFAS at any entry point. Failure to collect a confirmation sample is a monitoring reporting violation. Remember, that's for systems on annual or triennial monitoring. They have to collect that confirmation sample after an exceedance. And then failure to report any PFAS compliance sample. So a little plug here for using Dweller and checking Dweller. That, of course, is the system where all the results are loaded to Dweller. If you have your lab doing that, then you can get access to go in there and make sure your lab is reporting on time for you and checking for any errors and everything. So easiest thing to do is to go to the DEP website and go to the Dweller page. You can Google search for PA DEP Dweller. And there's references to this in your workbook associated with this on 4-7. Okay, let's talk now about what is the expected response to monitoring and reporting violations. Well, you have to contact DEP within 48 hours of becoming aware of any missed monitoring. And what we'll talk about is potentially collecting either a replacement sample or monitoring as soon as possible in the next monitoring period. It kind of depends on the timing here. If you are in, let's say, annual or triennial monitoring, you'll be asked to collect a replacement sample because we're not going to wait another year. But if it's quarterly monitoring, you're probably into the next quarter and you're just collecting it. You're just basically missed monitoring and you're collecting your next quarter. With any monitoring, reporting, or violations, it requires Tier 3 public notification, and we'll be covering that in the next lesson. All right, at this point, we'd like you to pause the recording and work on the activity, which is in your book on 4-8 in the associated materials. So go through that activity and pause the recording now, and then when you're ready to go over it, push play again and we'll go over the answers. Okay, so we're going to begin going over the answers for part 1 of the activity here. Rolling Embers water system is a groundwater system that serves approximately 1,500 people. They have one entry point 101, and the system completed initial monitoring in 2024, so this table shows their data. For question 1, you're asked to calculate the running annual average for PFOA and PFAS and fill in the MCL for both. So let's see what we got here. The running annual average, we calculated as 7 for that one. Remember that non-detects are counted as 0. And then we filled in the MCL, that's 14 for PFOA and 18 for PFAS. So the second question's asked, are there any MCL violations? And the answer is no. We did have that exceedance in the second quarter for PFOA, but the running annual average does not exceed the MCL. All right, question 3. Should the system have contacted DEP after that second quarter result? Yes. DEP should be contacted within 1 hour of any exceedance, even though at that point there wasn't any kind of violation yet. It was an MCL exceedance, so you're contacting DEP. So you had to go back to lesson 2 a little bit here and determine what is the repeat frequency for PFOA at entry point 101, and hopefully you came up with quarterly because they had that exceedance there in quarter 2. So quarters 3 and 4 are reliably and consistently below the MCL. Remember, you would need 4 quarters reliably and consistently below the MCL to get to annual. And that's all defined in that second lesson there if you need a review of that. So they're going to at least need 2 more quarters and staying on quarterly to do that. So what is the repeat monitoring frequency for PFAS at entry point 101? Well, that one they can go to triennial because they didn't have any detections there. So you can see how they'll end up on some different schedules here, potentially. All right, part 2, the first question there, we showed you that rolling embers did get to annual monitoring, and then in May of 2026, they had this result of 24 for PFOA. So the question is, should the system call DEP after learning of the result? Well, yeah, that's an MCL exceedance. Again, requires to notify DEP within 1 hour. And this is a point where in that conversation, we'll remind you of the required confirmation sample because you've had this exceedance while on annual. So we gave you those, or the second question, I should say, is this result in an immediate MCL violation? It's a little bit of a tricky question because when on annual monitoring, compliance is based on the average of the routine sample and the confirmation sample. So in this case, we don't know if it's a violation yet until it's averaged with the confirmation sample. So at this point in question 2, we didn't have that data yet. So a little bit of a trick in that question there. So number 3, though, calculate the average result and fill it in the table, which you could probably do in your head here. We had 24 and 22, which averages to 23. So at this point, do they have an MCL violation? Yes, they do, because the 23 calculated value is greater than the MCL of 14. So here again, it's a little different than when they're on quarterly and we're looking for running annual average. Here on annual monitoring, it's an immediate violation when we average those two together, if it's greater than the MCL. In this case, it is. So question 5 asked if rolling embers had not collected a confirmation sample, would they incur a monitoring violation? And yes, a monitoring violation for not collecting that confirmation sample. So what is the new frequency for PFOA at entry point 101? Well, quarterly. They exceeded the MCL while on annual, so now they go into what's called increased monitoring because they're going to quarterly monitoring. How long does the violation remain open from that May sampling? And of the choices there, it was answer C, until compliance is determined based on the running annual average of quarterly monitoring. Okay, good job on that. Just some key points here to tie everything together at the end of the lesson. If on quarterly monitoring, MCL compliance is based on the running annual average, but if the system is on annual or triennial for PFOA or PFAS, and you have an exceedance of one of those, you collect a confirmation sample, and then MCL compliance is based on the average of the routine and the confirmation sample. Always contact DEP within 1 hour of learning of an MCL exceedance. Thanks for watching.